Since her graduation from Centre College in Kentucky, she's worked in various fields as a barista, a wildlife journalist, and most recently, a writer for a global digital agency. In her junior year at the Governor's Academy, and that was in 2011-12, Imogene was a student in my advanced placement US history class. That year, I didn't allow complete freedom for students to choose their own research subject. Instead, in preparation for the Academy's 250th anniversary the following year, I directed them to focus their historical research on a subject concerning some aspect of the Academy's past. They grumbled for a while, quite a while, I have to say, until they began to realize they were examining subjects and writing histories that had never before been written. And they really came to feel pride in their work and in themselves on the Academy's 250th anniversary day, which was March 1st of 2013, when their presentations of their histories of the school to an audience of students and faculty, staff, parents, trustees, and alumni took center stage in the commemorative and the celebratory events of that day. Imogene produced one of the best of those historical research papers, a fascinating study of the Academy's first two swings and misses at Coeducation. Its third swing connected 50 years ago this year in the 1971-1972 school year, but twice in the late 19th century and at the turn of the 20th century, the Academy enrolled females for about a decade each time. What happened? No one knows more about this subject than Imogene. Since studying it as a high school student, she has investigated it further in her college studies and with an historical research grant that funded her work one summer. Consequent to Imogene's work, during the Academy's 250th commencement ceremonies in 2013, the Academy's faculty conferred diplomas to women who had completed the Academy's course of studies more than a century before, but had been denied diplomas per Dummer Academy's policy at that time. Imogene, who received her own diploma that day, presented those posthumous diplomas to living descendants of those unsung women. And so Imogene will now tell us their stories. Imogene.
Hi, everyone. I'm Imogene. Thank you for the really gracious introduction, Mr. Quigley. Let me see if I can share my screen real quick. All right, I think we're good to go. So hello, everyone. I'm here today to talk to you, as Mr. Quigley kind of outlined, about a couple periods of coeducation that took place in the 19th century. I started this research now like over 10 years ago, which is really crazy to think about. And as Mr. Quigley also mentioned, I started it as part of my thesis paper for my AP US history class. If anyone here isn't aware, if you take US history at Governor's, you're required to write a 20-page thesis paper, which is super intimidating if you're 16 years old. And as Mr. Quigley also said, my class in particular was told to write our thesis papers about a specific portion of Governor's history. And when I won the topic of 19th century coeducation, I was less than thrilled. I didn't know how I was going to turn the story of coeducation during the 19th century at a small school in Byfield, Massachusetts, into a 20-page paper. But that all changed pretty quickly when I found this article here. So this article appeared in a 1930s issue of the Archon, and it celebrates the life of a woman named Carrie Knight Ambrose. She was one of the first women to attend school at the Academy. And this article talks a lot about her role within the Governor's community, to which she stayed very connected to, and also how she went on to become a pillar of the greater Byfield community too. And this article really just helped me put sort of a face to the names of some of the women that I had already started to research and who had already started to learn about. At the same time, this article helped me understand the character of some of these women. And one other thing that I learned about when I discovered this article was that Carrie Knight Ambrose didn't actually receive her diploma in 1876. She didn't receive it until 1932, when she would have looked a lot like the older woman you see here. And that was because women weren't allowed to formally graduate the academy during these early years of coeducation. Instead, they only received certificates saying they had completed coursework there. And that injustice really sort of got to me and really led to me sort of latching onto this topic and developing some serious research questions. So some of the questions I wanted to learn more about during this research was, number one, what was the experience of coeducation like during the later 19th century? Did boys and girls sort of get along? Was there backlash within the community? Were they supported? What was kind of the vibe? Another question I had was, what did it mean for a school to be coeducational during this time? Was it something that was kind of commonplace, or was it sort of comparatively rare? And finally, the biggest question of all, I wanted to know, why did Dummer Academy, aka Govs, become coeducational in the first place? And even bigger question, maybe, why did it stop? So pretty quickly, I discovered the traditional view of early coeducation at the academy, which was just that 19th century coeducation was a financial means to a financial end. Essentially, coeducation was regarded as sort of a temporary measure of increasing enrollment, increasing tuition, and shoring up money in the bank. And a lot of other academy historians, they just sort of let the story stop there. That was it. It was just a temporary measure, not much else to report on. But what I found through my research was that there's a lot more than meets the eye to this story. And my thesis wound up centering around the role that these two gentlemen ended up playing. So who we have here are Ebenezer Parsons, headmaster at the academy from 1872 until 1882, and Pearlie Leonard Horn, who was headmaster from 1896 until 1904. Now, their two headmasterships overlap directly with these two early periods of coeducation. And that direct overlap sort of speaks directly to my thesis, which was that coeducation could not have continued at the academy for as long as it did, or even begun, had it not been for the active support and championing that these two men provided the young women during this time. So as I dive more into this topic, I thought it would be helpful to give you sort of an outline of what I'm going to talk about here tonight. So I'm going to talk about coeducation in its first part, which were the Parsons years. Also coeducation part 2, aka the Horn years. I'm also going to discuss these sort of intervening years, these sort of intervening years, which were defined by a, quote, return to first principles that I'll explain a little bit more as I go on. And finally, to cap it all off, I'll briefly sort of talk about how coeducation at the academy fit into the context of feminism and coeducation in 19th century America. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a couple alumna, Carrie Knight Ambrose and Ellen Riley. Carrie Knight Ambrose comes from the Parsons years, and Ellen Riley comes from the later Horn years. So let's talk about Parsons and coeducation. Parsons is hired by the Board of Trustees in 1872. And at the same time, the Board of Trustees records that female pupils suitably qualified may be by the principal admitted to the exercise of the school. And with that vote, they institute coeducation at Govs for the first time ever. Again, this is sort of the result of a financial need. The school is teetering on the edge of bankruptcy in 1872. But despite the fact that that the vote to move to coeducation is definitely a financial means to a financial end, Parsons' support of coeducation becomes pretty apparent right from the start. First of all, Parsons comes to us fresh from Pinkerton Academy up in Derry, New Hampshire. The interesting thing about Pinkerton Academy is that it's been coeducational since 1853. So Parsons comes to us not only from a place of experienced coeducational teaching, he also comes from a place where coeducation has been the norm for some time at this point. Moreover, we have the role that his wife, Sarah Parsons, played. Sarah Parsons is dubbed by many Academy historians a headmaster in her own right. She and her husband actually go on to effectively co-lead the school. If you look at the histories of other students from this era, the commentary on them is that they come from the Ebenezer and Sarah Parsons era of Academy history. So it becomes pretty clear that Parsons not only supported independent women, he came to rely on them and encouraged them to take up a significant role within the Academy during this time. Now, Parsons' support of coeducation also becomes apparent when we look at the experience of coeducation during this time. When I think about the experience of coeducation here, I like to think back to Anne of Green Gables. And if any of you have ever seen the movie or read the books, you'll recall the scene where Anne of Green Gables is teased by Gilbert, who's the boy you see here in this photo. He pulls on her pigtails and then she turns around and breaks her chalkboard over his head. And relations between girls and boys at Dummer during this time are sort of similar to that. There's some antagonism. There's one sort of excellent story of this boy who on his way to school discovered a big pile of snakes and he decided to bring them to school with him. And he hid them under the kitchen stove in the middle of the classroom and then just kind of sat back and waited for the snakes to get warm and come crawling out and cause chaos among the girls in class. But despite stories of antagonism like that, we also have stories of sort of chivalry and support. This is the young Carrie Knight Ambrose over here. And when asked to reflect back on her time at Gubs, she recalled one story where she was in math class and had to stand on tiptoe to write on the board. And her math teacher actually laughed at her for that. But rather than join in the laughter, the boys in her class marched straight over to Parsons's office and demanded that he make the math teacher apologize or they weren't going to go back to class. And that's exactly what Parsons did. So overall, coeducation during this time seems to have been a fairly positive experience, but it doesn't continue once Parsons announces his retirement. So Parsons announces his retirement in 1880. And at this point, it's become clear that the financial woes that forced Dummer Academy to start coeducation have continued. Before Parsons announces his retirement, he takes a significant reduction in his salary. The treasurer on the board of trustees resigns in order to pursue his own, or in order to keep track of his own business. Financial things just aren't looking good right now. And the board actually takes 2 whole years to find a new headmaster. And finally, in 1882, they hire a guy who I like to call Mr. Mutton Chops, John W. Perkins. And he is unanimously, resoundingly elected. And that is on the basis for what he calls his plan for a new departure. And the plan for a new departure it encompasses a couple things. Number one is Perkins decides to take some of the farmland on the Dummer Academy campus and turn it into a working farm that will generate some profit for the school. The other part of his plan is essentially a total rebrand of the school, and one that he would say makes a new departure somewhat of a misnomer. So this is a quote from Perkins 6 years into his headmastership during a speech he made at the 125th anniversary of the school. And in this quote, he says that the term "a new departure" is often inappropriately applied and misleading. For him, the new departure was actually an attempt to not push the school into a more progressive, exciting future, which one could argue is what Ebenezer and Sarah Parsons were trying to do. Instead, Perkins decided to go the other way and return to first principles, which for him meant returning Dummer Academy to a boys' boarding school, which essentially meant putting Latin back on the menu and taking coeducation off of it. So this begs the question, how did the return to first principles work? And I'm not sorry to say it didn't really work. Although Perkins's new departure managed to increase enrollment at the academy, it wasn't enough to keep the school out of bankruptcy. Perkins actually winds up investing some of his own money into the Dummer farm to try and keep it afloat. But it's ultimately all in vain, and he resigns defeated in 1894. It's sort of interesting to think, it's sort of an interesting thing to note that Perkins continues to appear in Board of Trustees meeting notes for years after he resigns. And that's because he owes money on his share of the farm that he bought. So his new departure really did not do well at all. After his resignation, the board temporarily appoints George B. Rogers, who is an experienced teacher, but as other historians remark, pretty much unremarkable. And at any rate, the Board of Trustees decides to not renew his contract in 1896. At this point, the trustees elect Pearlie Leonard Horn in 1896 and decide to bring a few young ladies from the village to school. Again, right away, Horn's support of coeducation is pretty apparent. He becomes good friends with the Byfield postmaster, a man named Frank Ambrose, as well as his wife, who is none other than Carrie Knight Ambrose. That Horn became friends with an early alumna, as we'll call her, is pretty much testament to the fact that he would have heard what went wrong during the Parsons run of coeducation and also learn what went right. And it also seems like he became an earnest supporter of coeducation that way. He and Carrie Knight Ambrose end up being friends for years after this. He's even mentioned in her obituary when she dies. One other sign of support Horn lent young women during this time is when he provided boarding for a female student named Catherine Crowe. Crowe and her brother Frank attended the academy together as day students. In 1901, the Crowe family announced that they were going to be moving from that area. And for both students, this was troublesome news. Frank was scheduled to go on to college in the fall, and he didn't want to abandon his studies midway through his senior year. For Frank, the solution to his predicament was relatively simple. He just had to become a boarding student. But for Catherine, who also didn't want to leave her studies unfinished before she left, the problem was a lot more difficult. She, as a woman, could not board at the academy during this time. Fortunately, Horn intervened on Catherine's behalf and allowed her to live at the mansion house with him in order to finish her studies. So that Horn played such a significant role, did not mean to do that. That Horn played such a significant role in the student's life and deliberately went out of his way to ensure that she could continue learning at Dummer Academy is again another sign that he was an active supporter and an active champion of young women during this time period. Again, though, we have some stories of antagonism at the academy during this time. For one, during this era, women received the collective title, the Annex, signifying that they were very much a separate entity from the boys during this time. The boys also routinely made fun of the girls. We have stories about two sisters who would regularly take a pony cart to school, which the boys mocked them for. And we also have this really nasty comment posted in the student paper from some of the boys making fun of Cora Ambrose, saying that we hear Cora Ambrose has gained 10 pounds. If she gains any more weight, she won't be able to walk. When asked to reflect back upon her experience at the Academy during this time, much later, this other alumna had this to say. This is a quote from Ellen Riley. She says, "I spent a year as a day student at Dummer, graduating with the class of 1903. I've always regretted that year, sorry that the Academy was so embarrassed that it welcomed female students." So again, we have more stories that show that women weren't exactly having the greatest time during this period of coeducation. And also it serves as a reminder that women weren't allowed to formally graduate, in addition to experiencing this antagonism from some of the boys. And that the board had only accepted them in the interest of money. We do have one bright spot in the school paper, though, recording results of a student debate surrounding coeducation. In 1898, the debate club at Dummer Academy debated the resolution that Dummer Academy should be coeducational. Arguing the affirmative were two students named Roy Johnson and Catherine Crowe. And on the opposition were two students named Mary Burns and Warren Small. The negative team argued that inherent differences between the boys and the girls made segregated education the better option. At the present time, Small argued, although young ladies are allowed to attend, they are not recognized as members of the Academy. They are not boarded and their names do not appear in the catalogs. The crux of Small's argument was that the Annex was barely even a part of the school, so why should it be there at all? On the contrary, though, in her argument for the affirmative team, Catherine Crowe contended that Dummer, situated as it was, offered the only opportunity which was open to the young ladies of Byfield to receive a higher education. Her colleague, Roy Johnson, rose in defense of her point, arguing that the Academy had been generously founded by Governor William Dummer, primarily for the youth of Byfield. And youth did not come with a gender. Ultimately, a panel of judges consisting of 3 male faculty members voted in favor of the affirmative, that Dummer Academy should be coeducational. The vote in the debate as a whole signifies maybe a growing level of support for coeducation in spite of some of the antagonism that I've just highlighted. Sadly, though, it appears that this was purely a moral victory. Ultimately, despite the return of coeducation, financial problems again continue to plague the Academy. And they don't go away until Charles Ingham ultimately takes the helm of the school in 1907. Horn is eventually fired by the Board of Trustees in 1904. He leaves and actually leaves Massachusetts altogether. He moves to Hawaii, where he becomes president of Kamehameha Schools, a school that is coincidentally coeducational, signifying Horn's continued support. Meanwhile, coeducation at the Academy is abandoned until 1972, which, as Mr. Quigley sort of spoke to at the beginning of this presentation, it's been 50 years now, and there's no sign of coeducation going anywhere. So as I said before, I kind of want to talk about how coeducation at Dummer Academy during this time fits into the context of this period of history and of 19th century feminism and coeducation within the US. So during the 19th century, what we're seeing is a burgeoning women's rights movement. We have people like the Grimke sisters, who you can see down here. The Grimke sisters are leaders of a suffragette organization, and they actually, at the start of the Parsons sort of years at Govs, are leading a suffragette march through a blizzard campaigning for women's rights. At the same time, we're seeing a growing regional acceptance of coeducation in higher ed. So that occurs across the spectrum. You have colleges in the Midwest like Oberlin, which go fully coeducational as early as the 1850s. And then at the other end, you have the South, in which coeducation is few and far between. Meanwhile, in New England, you have this weird sort of compromised coeducation happening. In 1879, Harvard founds the Harvard Annex, which eventually becomes Radcliffe College. And one feminist, Lucy Stone from the American Women's Suffragette Association, says that our demand that Harvard and Yale colleges should admit women only waits for a little more time. And while they wait, numerous petty female colleges have sprung into being. So by Lucy Stone's token, Demmer Academy's early experiments with coeducation are almost ahead of their time in terms of New England, in terms of what coeducation in New England looked like. Boys and girls were educated in the same classroom. They were taught the same courses by the same teacher. But obviously there was still quite a ways to go with them. As I sort of wrap things up, I want to talk about a couple of alumna who I think are important to highlight. And I say alumna because I say alumna without quotations around them because they did ultimately receive diplomas. First of all, we have Carrie Knight Ambrose. You can see her during her time at Governors over here, and her in her older years over here. Carrie Knight Ambrose, as I've already sort of mentioned, went on to become very much a pillar in her community. She goes on to found the Dummer Allies, which those of you from Govs will be familiar with. And her husband, the postmaster, Frank Ambrose, after he passes away, she actually takes over and becomes postmistress. And she actually really makes a name for herself in that role and becomes like a real pillar in the community, even being sort of, even being remembered more than Frank was in his time. And we know that because we have this plaque here, which was put on the original postmaster's house, 35 Elm Street, after Carrie Knight passes away. And you'll note that it is purely for her and not for her husband, which is kind of cool. Another really fascinating woman that I want to mention is Ellen Riley, the woman who was so dissatisfied with her experience of coeducation at Govs. Despite the fact that her experience was less than positive and is sort of an ugly scar on Academy history, Ellen Riley goes on to have what I think is one of the most fascinating careers of anyone to have come out of Govs that I've heard about, at least. She leaves Governors and ends up working at, of all places, the White House during the Coolidge administration. She becomes the Coolidge's housekeeper, which might not sound like much, but is actually a pretty big deal. She has a staff of over a dozen people, reports directly to the First Lady, Grace Coolidge, who's the woman in these photos. And together with Grace, she plans banquets, galas, events for guests of honor at the White House. She actually meets quite a lot of sort of honoraries, dignitaries, and celebrities of her time. The biggest one of which is Queen Marie of Romania, who you can see on the cover of Time down here. Queen Marie was a huge deal to have in the US at all, and especially for someone to get to host. She was famously an independent, powerful woman, and also quite bohemian for her time. And Ellen Riley was just over the moon to be able to host her. Another sort of interesting part of Ellen's tenure at the White House is her relationship with the Coolidge pets. So the Coolidges were famous for their wide variety of pets. They had dogs, cats, horses. They even had a couple lions at one point. And they had this lovely chubby little raccoon that you see here. This is Rebecca the raccoon, who was a gift from one of the Coolidge's supporters, a hunter in Virginia who who did not have much to give in order to show his support for the Coolidges. So he decided to give the one thing he could find, which happened to be a raccoon. And Ellen Riley and Grace Coolidge grew incredibly fond of the raccoon, and were just entertained to no end by its shenanigans. Ellen Riley remembers fondly like giving Rebecca a bath and how she would take a bar of soap in there and essentially like scrub the little bathtub, moving it around. And another final interesting thing to note about her and her career is her relationship with the First Lady, Grace Coolidge. They became incredibly close. And it actually, during my research into this, my revisitation of this research during college, I went up to Barre, Vermont and explored the Ellen Agnes Riley archives in the Historical Society up there. And they have boxes and boxes of correspondence between Ellen Riley and Grace Coolidge. They were friends until Grace ultimately died. And it's just testament to how far Ellen went. And in her letters, she recalls in her letters, as she recalls all of her experiences during the White House, she's well aware of her accomplishments and the role that she played in the White House, which is really cool to see. So to close my talk here, I want to show you guys this quote. As I was putting together this presentation, I stumbled across another Archon article, this one from 2002, when the Academy was celebrating the 30th anniversary of permanent coeducation at Govs. And in this quote from Kathleen Livermore, who was from the class of 1979, not 1879, I'd make one small amendment that a couple really interesting changes occurred between 1763 and 1972. But I do wholeheartedly agree with her that the women who came before you do have stories to tell and that they're well worth telling. And that's it.
That was wonderful, Imogene. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
What a great view into a part of our history that that I certainly was not aware of. That's wonderful. That was great. Thank you so much. So, first of all, I want a pet raccoon. Let's just get that out of the way. My question was that a picture of Grace Coolidge, or was that her holding the raccoon?
That was Grace Coolidge. So it's sort of funny, when I went up to Barre, Vermont, and I was reviewing these archives from Ellen Riley, most of the photos that were there were of the Coolidges. Ellen seems to have sort of been like a bit of like a pop culture fanatic of her day. So she had a lot of photos of the Coolidges doing day-to-day things, and a ton of photos of Grace holding the pets or with the pets. Nice.
Well, I'm a fan of anyone who loves animals, so that's a big plus for me in my book.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna look in the chat really quickly. Bill was wondering if you would speak a bit more about your research and resourcefulness in digging out this history. How much did you find in the Academy's archives, and what other sources did you come across?
I found almost all of my research came out of the Academy's archives. One thing I really valued about this project that we were given as 16-year-olds was that it really taught me how to deal with original sources. I read a lot of really old handwriting, which is a skill that is underappreciated, I think. And the other portion of it that I found I had to do was even just some light Googling here and there would bring me to like genealogy trees and sort of help me discover what happened to some of these women after they left the academy, or in the case of the headmasters, where they went, where they came from, and different things like that.
We've got another question here from Mike Robinson. Can you speak about when and how Ambrose and Riley finally received their diplomas? It sounds like maybe you handed one of them out, didn't you?
Yeah, so I'm glad Mike asked that question. So Carrie Knight Ambrose was the first woman to receive a diploma from governors. I think she received it in 1932. And that was during, again, like a regular sort of graduation celebration at Govs. And I think she had been such a strong person within the community that they felt she was owed that. So she was awarded her diploma back in the 30s. Ellen Riley, I actually tried to find any descendants of hers. And when I couldn't find them, instead of handing one of them a diploma during my graduation, I actually had Elizabeth Rule, who some of you might know from Govs. She's been there for years and years, and I felt that she would be an excellent person to receive the diploma on behalf of Ellen Riley.
Wonderful. I actually have a question. I'm curious about the young women that were admitted to Govs in its various iterations. Where did they tend to be from? Have you been able to sort of pinpoint what it was about governors that was attractive to those particular young women?
So they were all local. They were primarily all from Byfield, or like one of the surrounding communities like Ipswich and Newburyport. And that was because they weren't allowed to board. And during the 1800s, you didn't have cars really to take you around. So they were all local for the most part. It should be noted too that if you were a local student during this period, you were supposed to receive a discounted tuition. And girls, because they were sort of a moneymaker for the Board of Trustees, they did not receive the discount. So they paid the full tuition price. That was a whopping $7 back in the day.
That is quite a moneymaker, right?
Yeah.
Wow. It's amazing how quickly money can change people's minds about what's important to the school.
Yeah.
Can I
Bill.
interject with a question?
Sure, please.
About this? You mentioned that Catherine Crowe, who through family circumstances left and went to Maine, but ended up being the first female boarding student at the academy.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Frank. We can share with the audience. He built the Hoover Dam. He goes on to be the chief engineer of the Hoover Dam and many of those dams that were built out in the western part of the country during the 30s and 40s. Did she go on to a career that you know of?
I did try to find a career of hers. I did not, but I do remember knowing the accomplishments of her brother. One of my other fellow members of the class of 2013, I think it was Andy Werchniak, researched Frank. So it was sort of funny to see that we had like this weird overlap. But yeah, from what I know, Catherine didn't go on to really have a career of her own, just her brother. And again, this like just speaks to like Ellen Riley's accomplishments, and even Carrie Knight Ambrose's. They really did go on to have full-fledged careers at a time when like that was incredibly unusual. When Ellen Riley got the housekeeper job at the White House, it was in all of the Boston papers that she had landed. It said, Miss Riley has won a fine job, and that she'd be going to Washington.
Thank you.
That's very much like what it said in the Daily News when I got this job.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions actually in the chat. One is, can you tell us how many girls total attended the school during those 2 periods?
It's hard to tell. The student catalogs, which kept a record of all the names of students who attended during this period, they're sort of, they have a mixed reliability of including the girls. Some of them do have them, some of them don't. Other ones are just lost to history. But I'd say it's safe to say around 60. So 30-ish during each period of about 10 years.
Another question, during the second period of coeducation, what was the curriculum? Did it remain classical, Latin, math, geography, public speaking, and debate? What, do you have any idea of how that changed?
I think it stayed classical, from what I remember. I don't know off the top of my head though. It's something I probably would have been able to answer a while ago, but it's not out of my brain at this point.
It's okay. Were the classes actually coeducational, like within the classroom?
They were, which is kind of a big deal. Girls weren't put in a different building. They weren't forced to take like housekeeping classes. I do remember that dancing was required of both boys and girls during this time. The one class I do remember thinking, wow, I'm impressed they made boys take that.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder if the boys had to take dancing when there were not girls on campus.
That's a good question. There are an awful lot of photos of, or as I remember, most of the photos of Perkins are of him doing very manly things with all of the boys.
Dancing is manly.
Yeah, because he had those big button chops. You know, he's really
had something to prove, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
We have another question. Did some of the women during the early years go on to college?
Not really. This was sort of regarded as their source of higher education during this time. By the start of the 19th century, it had become expected that women would have some education. They'd learn how to read and write. And by the mid 1850s, most of America's teachers are women, or America's primary and secondary teachers at least are women. But yeah, not many people went on to college from Dummer Academy, at least from what I know. I did try to see if anyone went on to Radcliffe specifically, because Harvard and Govs had really sort of long-standing ties. But yeah, I couldn't find any evidence of that.
Interesting. Yeah, I read somewhere that at some point 25% of the Harvard undergraduates were from Dummer's Academy.
It was like you look back on during this time, you'd find like the list of future plans for the young men, and almost all of them would be Harvard or MIT, one or the other. Yeah.
Wow.
Horn himself was he went to Harvard.
Wonderful. All right, any other questions for Imogene? Just pop them into the chat. We've got a minute or two here. That early handwriting, the mastery of early handwriting, is going to be very valuable when we rope you into volunteering for us. So you're going to be sorry you admitted to that.
I actually really wanted to show you guys some of Grace Coolidge's letters to Ellen Riley. But unfortunately, her handwriting is one of the ones that you really like. It just looks like a squiggle if you're new to it.
Yeah, it takes some practice for sure. It is like another language. I see Bill back on screen. Did you want to?
Yeah, I just this is tangential, but the photograph you showed of the second period, Imogene, and was a number of female students. It was during Horn's time, so right around, it wasn't dated, but it was right around the turn of the century.
Yeah, I can actually.
But there is if you show that again, it might be interesting to the audience. So this was maybe 1898 to 1903 or so. And if you look, there's a Black male student there.
Oh, yes, there is. I see him.
And it's really interesting. I didn't have a student that year And I'm hoping some year to have a student who's going to study this same period of time you've studied and the presence of students of color at the school, because there are a number of students of color. In some of the photographs from this period, there might be 2. I've never seen more than 3. But here's where there's a single person. And it's interesting. And there's got to be some interesting stories there.
Mm.
I know that one of them, who was here at the school for a year and a half, was Booker T. Washington's eldest son.
Yeah.
Like this young man here, I have no idea.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. And when I was researching this period, I didn't find anything about race at all recorded during this time.
Well,
But
that
I
wasn't
do know
the
that.
focus, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But I do know that if anyone's been in the school library at Govs, they have a big mural of Academy history that went up when I graduated. Carrie Knight Ambrose is on there, and Booker T. Washington is too, I believe.
Yes.
Now, was that her revenge for the gaining of the 10 pounds? She gets to be on the
That was actually, I think, her niece.
her niece. Okay, different Ambrose.
Yeah, so this is the other big thing I found during my research here is there's so many local families that just had become really big and none of them ever left. So the amount of Ambroses and Knights and Crows and I'm trying to think.
There's some noises in there too,
yeah.
I bet. Yeah.
Jewett were another name that like they appeared everywhere. Yeah.
Great. We've got one more question. During the 1960s, we had only 1 or 2 women as teachers. Were there women teaching at Govs in the 1800s?
The only female teacher I ever saw recorded was the dance teacher.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. But
that's
yeah.
very interesting. Wonderful, wonderful questions, everybody.
Did sort of teach too, but informally.
Yeah, you were saying that the headmaster's wife was sort of a headmaster in her own right.
Yes. She was a experienced teacher herself, but I think that was just for like for younger age people. But she, like I said, definitely played a role in the education one way or another.
Oh, we got a great question here. We certainly have time for this last one. I'm curious, what lessons do you think current administrators at Govs or at a similar school might draw from your research? I'm sure these challenges around change, progress, school direction, et cetera, all remain relevant. It's a big question.
That is a big question, and it's one that I'm not sure I can answer super effectively. I think, if anything, my research shows that there's a lot sort of hidden in history that might surprise people. And there's also some things that, especially for students, that this is worth that students note, I think. There's a lot of things that are sort of unsavory about schools, and we can always point the finger at private schools, I think. But really, with any sort of institution, there's always some ugly history that no one really wants to acknowledge. But it is worth sort of understanding where that perspective came from, and even acknowledging some of the more positive experiences, I think, too. The past is super complicated, and I think there's ups and downs that are worth looking at. I'm trying to think too. I mean, I honestly think that the assignment, as Mr. Quigley's original assignment, is also one that I think a lot of other teachers could learn from too. Like I said, I was the opposite of excited when I first started researching it, but having done it, it's something that I think I really have come to value over the years.
It's wonderful. Don't make decisions based solely on money. How's
Yes,
that?
The other big takeaway. And raccoons make great pets.
And raccoons make great pets. I love it. How did it feel? I mean, I guess this is my question. How did it feel for you in that moment when you were able to sort of, even though obviously it was posthumous, but what was it like for you to be able to give diplomas to these women who had been denied that so many years ago? I mean, talking about things that are relevant still from a school's past.
It was really cool. And I really remember a lot of the descendants I was able to find were interested in genealogy. And I think a lot of times, like, the older you get, the more interested in genealogy you become. And so some of the women who I awarded diplomas on behalf of their ancestors to, they were older women, and I could tell they were just so touched in hearing about the accomplishments of what their ancestors had done. And that was really cool to see them feel that much, and be that passionate that they would show up to this. I remember calling people on the phone and asking them to come to my graduation so that I could award a diploma on behalf of, like, their great aunt. And a few people agreed to that kind of harebrained scheme, and they were
It's
really
wonderful.
Yeah.
For the record, I would have come for sure.
Yeah.
Totally.
You're one of the good ones.
It's just a little sort of writing of the balance of the universe. I can totally get behind that. That's wonderful. Bill, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I don't. Just a really enthusiastic thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to Mr. Quigley, I should say.
Absolutely.
I always really enjoy talking about this one.
I'm gonna echo that as well. Thank you so much for coming on and telling us, sharing this wonderful story with us. It really is an incredibly compelling story. I kind of want to go back and research all these individual young women and find out what happened to every single one of them. This is how we get nothing done in this office.
Yeah.
But if you ever want to do more research on any of them, of course, the repositories of the Museum of Old Newbury are at your service. So thank you. Thank you, Imogene. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to another Museum of Old Newbury program. I know we're all giving you a virtual round of applause here. That was just wonderful. I would like to invite all of you to please join us next week for another program, another virtual program, exploring the Newburyport Black History Initiative. So if you can sign up for that on our website. I also would like to thank everybody here who is a member and volunteer for the Museum of Old Newbury. If you're not a member and you'd like to become one, you can also do that on our website, which is newburyhistory.org. So with that, I'm Bethany Groff-Dureau, the Executive Director, and I will thank you again and bid you all a fond good night. Good night, everyone.